formerly the Gold Coast.
A brilliant African doctor discovered a drug that saved millions of lives across Africa in the 1940s, got nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and then died mysteriously in a Hamburg hospital at 40. His wife said he told her he'd been poisoned. His gravestone in Hamburg reads, "Africa's Greatest Nationalist." So why have most people never heard his name? In 1913, a child was born in Keta, Gold Coast, in a region torn apart by European colonial powers. By the time he was 40, Dr. Raphael Ernest Grail Armattoe had mastered 6 languages, discovered a revolutionary drug that treated waterborne diseases and parasites, addressed the United Nations about African unity, published groundbreaking anthropological research, written poetry that's still studied today, and become one of the most respected intellectuals in Africa and Europe. Then he died suddenly in Germany while traveling home from the UN, and his wife reported he'd been poisoned. This is the story of an African genius whose legacy was nearly erased, whose contributions were systematically undervalued, and whose mysterious death left more questions than answers. This is about a man who refused to stay in the limited box colonial powers tried to build around African intellect. Raphael Ernest Grail Armattoe was born on August 12, 1913 in Keta, in what is now Ghana's Volta region. His father, Robert Glickpo Armattoe, was a prominent merchant in Togoland who traded mainly with German businesses and studied local indigenous languages. This was a family that valued education, commerce, and cultural preservation. Armattoe grew up during a period of violent colonial disruption. Togoland had been a German protectorate, but after World War I ended in 1918, European powers sliced the territory into pieces as war spoils. Part went to British control. Part went to French control. Families were split. Communities were divided by artificial borders. The U people, Armattoe's ethnic group, suddenly found themselves scattered across 3 separate colonial territories: British Togoland, French Togoland, and the Gold Coast. This colonial violence would shape Armattoe's entire political philosophy for the rest of his life. Because his region changed hands from German to British to French control, young Armattoe learned to navigate multiple colonial languages. He became fluent in German, French, and English, while also speaking his native U. Later in life, he would add Spanish and Portuguese to that list, making him comfortable in 6 languages. This wasn't just impressive linguistic ability, it was a survival skill for an African intellectual trying to operate in a world controlled by European powers. Armattoe received his early education in Lomé, Togoland, then completed his primary education in Danu, Gold Coast. Between 1925 and 1928, he attended Mfensipim School in Cape Coast, one of the first and most prestigious secondary schools in Ghana. At Mfensipim, he met Kofi Abrefa Bizia, who would later become Ghana's prime minister from 1969 to 1972. Even as teenagers, these young men understood they were being trained to lead a future independent Africa. At just 17 years old in 1930, Armattoe left Africa for Germany to pursue higher education. He studied at Hamburg University, immersing himself in European academic culture while maintaining his African identity in perspective. But by the early 1930s, something dark was rising in Germany. The Nazi Party was gaining power, bringing with it violent racism and hatred toward anyone considered non-Aryan. Armattoe, as a black African man in Germany, recognized the danger immediately. He left Germany for France, where the political climate was slightly less threatening. In France, Armattoe continued his studies at the Sorbonne and Lille universities, pursuing anthropology, literature, and medicine. This multidisciplinary approach would define his entire career. He refused to be confined to a single field or a single way of thinking. It was in France that he met Leonie Schwartz, a Swiss woman who would become his wife and lifelong partner. Leonie, who later became known as Marina, married Armattoe and committed to sharing his life journey between Europe and Africa. After completing his studies in France, Armattoe and his wife moved to Edinburgh, Scotland, where he qualified to practice medicine at the Royal College of Surgeons. In 1938, with a full medical qualification, Armattoe began looking for work as a doctor. He secured a locum position in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and then was appointed to the Civil Defence First Aid Post in Brook Park, Derry, where he worked from 1939 to 1945 throughout World War II. After the war ended, he opened his own medical practice at his home on 7 Northland Road in Derry. Armattoe's years in Northern Ireland were extraordinary. As the only black doctor and one of the very few black residents in Derry during the 1940s, he became a beloved figure in the community. Patients remembered him as a marvelous doctor. Elsa MC Millen Spence, who met him at a lecture series in her 20s, recalled decades later. Of all the speakers, he was the best. He was a marvelous talker and could keep you spellbound with his knowledge of many subjects. The New York Post called him the Irishman from West Africa, and the BBC producer Henry Swansea gave him the nickname the African Paracelsus, comparing him to the revolutionary Renaissance physician. But Armattoe wasn't just practicing medicine. He was conducting research, writing prolifically, and building a reputation as one of Africa's leading intellectuals. He established the Lomshi Research Center, named after his mother, and used it as a base to publish scientific papers, anthropological studies, and political pamphlets. By his own count, he had published over 150 articles by the mid-1940s. During his time in Northern Ireland, Armattoe gave lectures to diverse groups: the Great James Street Women's Guild, the Amateur Radio Club, and the St. John's Ambulance Society. He wrote articles for the Londonderry Sentinel and for prestigious academic journals like Man, Nature, and African Affairs. In 1946, he published The Golden Age of West African Civilization, a groundbreaking historical text that challenged European narratives about African history. The book's foreword was written by Erwin Schrödinger, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, who Armattoe had befriended at the 1947 Nobel Prize ceremonies in Stockholm. Armattoe was the only African among the 1,000 intellectuals invited to that event. But Armattoe's most famous contribution was medical, the abachi drug. Through his research combining traditional African herbal medicine with modern pharmacology, Armattoe developed a preparation that proved highly effective against parasitic diseases that devastated African communities. Guinea worms, ringworms, hookworms, waterborne bacterial infections, bronchitis, boils, and related ailments, these conditions killed and disabled millions of Africans who lacked access to expensive imported pharmaceuticals. The abachi drug offered an affordable, locally producible solution. Multiple sources confirmed that the drug saved millions of lives in Africa in the 1940s. The Nigerian government recognized the drug's value and purchased the patent for thousands of pounds, a significant sum at the time. The drug was manufactured and distributed across Africa under the name abachi, making treatment accessible to communities that had been ignored by Western pharmaceutical companies. This wasn't just scientific achievement, it was an act of service to African people. In 1948, Armattoe successfully applied for a £3,000 anthropological research grant from the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research, one of the most prestigious funding sources for anthropology in the world. This grant allowed him to return to West Africa for the first time in 18 years. He spent 6 months conducting field research, focusing primarily on physical anthropology, particularly studying blood group distributions, a cutting-edge field at the time. He also studied ancient herbal medicines in County Donegal and collected African botanical specimens to analyze their medicinal properties. After returning to Derry to write up his research reports, Armattoe presented his findings in 1949. The response was extraordinary. Members of Stormont, the Dáil Éireann, and 3 Westminster members of Parliament joined together to nominate Dr. Armattoe for the 1949 Nobel Peace Prize. This nomination recognized not just his medical discoveries, but his broader humanitarian work and his efforts to bridge African traditional knowledge with modern science. The prize ultimately went to John Boyd Orr, director of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, but the nomination itself placed Armattoe among the most respected scientists and humanitarians in the world. In 1950, Armattoe and his family left Derry and moved to Kumasi in what was soon to become independent Ghana. There, he established a medical clinic and research center, continuing his work in medicine while increasingly devoting time to poetry, writing, and politics. His first poetry collection, Between the Forest and the Sea, was published in 1950. His second collection, Deep Down in the Black Man's Mind, was published posthumously in 1954 and remains studied in African literature courses today. But Armattoe's move back to Africa wasn't just about medicine and literature. It was deeply political. The late 1940s and early 1950s were a time of intense political organizing across Africa as independence movements gained momentum. Armattoe had attended the historic 1945 Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England, alongside future leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Hastings Banda, Jomo Kenyatta, and W.E.B. Du Bois. All these men favored independence for African colonies, but they disagreed sharply on how that independence should look. Armattoe's political position was clear and unwavering. He believed in federalism and ethnic unity, specifically the reunification of the Yu people who had been divided by colonial borders. He joined the Ghana Congress Party, led by Justice Nyai Ama Alanu, and including figures like his old schoolmate K.A. Bizia, rather than Kwame Nkrumah's Convention People's Party. This was a principled decision, but it would cost him politically. Armattoe became highly active in the Joint Togoland Congress, advocating for the reunification of British Togoland and French Togoland into a single independent nation, rather than having British Togoland absorbed into Ghana. He argued that the Yu people deserved their own unified nation-state, respecting their cultural and linguistic identity instead of forcing them into artificial colonial borders. This put him directly at odds with Nkrumah's vision of a larger Ghana. In 1953, Armattoe led a delegation to New York City to address the United Nations Fourth Committee on Yulan Question and Togoland Unification. Die Welt, a major German newspaper, called his UN address one of the most important documents in African history in the 20th century. This was Armattoe at the height of his influence. A respected scientist, a Nobel Peace Prize nominee, and now a voice for African self-determination on the world's most important political stage. After addressing the UN, Armattoe planned to return to Ghana for Christmas with his wife and daughters. But first, he stopped in Dublin to visit his eldest daughter, Erasure, who was enrolled in a boarding school there. Then he traveled to Germany. While en route, he fell suddenly and seriously ill. He was taken to a hospital in Hamburg, where he died on December 21, 1953, at just 40 years old. His wife Marina was waiting anxiously in Ghana for her husband's Christmas return. When she received the devastating news of his death, she told friends something that would haunt his legacy forever. Her husband had told her he'd been poisoned, though he didn't know by whom. This allegation was never officially investigated. No autopsy report was made public. No official cause of death was ever confirmed. Armattoe was simply buried in Hamburg, and the question of what really killed him remained unanswered. The circumstances surrounding his death raise serious questions. According to Wikipedia sources, Armattoe had apparently been attacked previously by supporters of Kwame Nkrumah for withholding the cure to swollen shoot unless the government approached him in a respectful manner, having chosen to distance himself from Nkrumah's government. This suggests there was documented political hostility toward Armattoe from Nkrumah's supporters in the years before his death. Armattoe had refused to simply hand over his scientific work to a government he disagreed with politically. He demanded respect, proper recognition, and appropriate compensation for his intellectual labor. This wasn't arrogance, it was a black scientist refusing to let his discoveries be appropriated without acknowledgement. But this principled stance made him enemies in powerful places. Was he actually poisoned? We may never know with certainty. What we do know is that a 40-year-old man in apparently good health died suddenly while traveling, far from home, after making powerful political enemies, and his widow believed he'd been murdered. The fact that no thorough investigation was conducted speaks volumes about how expendable African intellectuals were considered, even those with international reputations. Armattoe was buried in Hamburg, Germany. His gravestone bears the inscription, "Africa's Greatest Nationalist," a recognition of his lifelong fight for African unity and self-determination. In 2012, the Ulster History Circle unveiled a blue plaque at 7 Northland Road in Derry, where he had lived and practiced medicine. His son Stanley Armattoe attended the ceremony and said the plaque was a remarkable acknowledgement of his father's impact on the people of Derry and of the positive part played by African people in the life and culture of the city and of Northern Ireland. But despite these memorials, Armattoe's name remains largely unknown outside specialist circles. Why? Several forces conspired to erase his legacy. First, he didn't fit neatly into any single national narrative. He was Ghanaian, but spent his most productive years in Ireland. He was a medical doctor, but also an anthropologist, poet, and politician. He opposed Nkrumah, who became Ghana's founding father and whose version of history dominated post-independence narratives. Second, the Abachi drug, despite saving millions of lives, never entered the global pharmaceutical system in a way that would keep Armattoe's name attached to it. The Nigerian government bought the patent and manufactured it, but without the institutional backing of Western pharmaceutical companies and medical journals, the drug remained a regional solution rather than a globally recognized medical breakthrough. Third, his death at 40 cut short what should have been decades more of scientific contribution, political organizing, and literary production. He died before Ghana gained full independence, before his vision for Togoland unification could be properly debated, and before he could consolidate his scientific legacy. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the Western-dominated historical record has systematically undervalued African contributions to science, medicine, and global intellectual life. Armattoe's work on parasitic diseases, blood group distribution, and ethnobotany should place him alongside other mid-century medical pioneers. His Nobel Peace Prize nomination should be taught in schools. His poetry should be more widely read. But because he was African, because he operated partially outside Western institutional structures, and because he died mysteriously before his work could be fully documented and celebrated, his legacy was allowed to fade. The story of Dr. Raphael Ernest is not just about one brilliant man. It's about the systematic erasure of African intellectual achievement. It's about how colonial powers and their institutional descendants decide whose contributions matter and whose can be forgotten. It's about how African scientists who insisted on respect and fair compensation were labeled difficult, while their discoveries were appropriated. It's about how political disagreements within independence movements were used to silence certain voices and elevate others. Armattoe refused to accept the limitations that colonial structures tried to impose on African minds. He mastered multiple disciplines. He moved fluidly between European and African intellectual worlds. He insisted that traditional African knowledge had value alongside Western science. He demanded that African ethnic groups have the right to self-determination instead of being forced into colonial borders. And he paid for that refusal with isolation, political marginalization, and possibly his life. Today, in 2024, when we talk about decolonizing science and recognizing non-Western knowledge systems, we should be talking about figures like Raphael Ernest. When we discuss African contributions to global medicine, his name should be mentioned alongside any Western pharmaceutical pioneer. When we study the Pan-African movement and African independence, his federalist vision and advocacy for ethnic self-determination deserve serious consideration, not dismissal because he opposed the winning side. The inscription on his gravestone got it right: Africa's greatest nationalist. Not because he was perfect, but because he spent his entire life fighting for African people, African knowledge, African unity, and African dignity in a world determined to deny all four. His legacy lives on in the millions of lives saved by the Abachi drug. It lives on in his poetry and anthropological research. It lives on in the memory of patients in Derry who remember the brilliant black doctor who cared for them during World War II. And it lives on in every African scientist, writer, and political organizer who refuses to be confined by the boxes others try to build around them.